I'm delighted to be here with Father Joseph Fessio. As founder of Ignatius Press, I think really one of the most consequential figures in the last 50 or 60 years. So, Father, delighted we have a chance to visit and talk today.
I'm glad to be here too, Bishop.
Oh, good, good. Hey, listen, you're a California kid. I spent 6 years out in California. You were educated in Jesuit institutions as a young man, then joined the society when you're, about 20 or so?
20 years old, yes.
Tell me about that. We're talking about 1960 or so, the years just before the council. What was it like? What was your intellectual formation like in those years?
Well, we had the traditional formation at the time. It was a wonderful experience for me because I didn't, I was with Jesuits in high school and in college, but I didn't realize they prayed until I actually entered the novitiate. And I had a wonderful master of novices, Father Ralph Drendel. And there were 104 of us.
Yeah, big group.
Over 2 years, you know. But the first 2 years, of course, was mainly spiritual preparation, formation, the constitutions, and Ignatian exercises. Then philosophy, of course, we had a very Thomistic philosophical training. I went to Mount St. Michael's up in Washington, state of Washington. And then, of course, that was 61 when I entered, and I began my theology in 69. It was already after the council, and that was in France. That was quite different. Already things had started to fall apart at that point.
Right, that was a volatile time. You're ordained about 72.
72,
right?
yeah.
I think of, I'm a Chicago priest originally, and the biggest classes in the history of Mundelein Seminary were in the 60s, mid to late 60s. But the class of 67, I think, was the biggest. That was, 70 students, something like that. But you look at that picture now, well over 2/3 have left the priesthood. So it was a time of kind of massive collapse, wasn't it, within the priesthood?
Definitely was.
I'm always intrigued in people of your generation who stayed. Why did you stay? As you look back and so many of your colleagues were leaving, what made you stay?
I made a promise to God.
Makes a difference, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was a demoralizing time for a lot of people, I know.
But also, I thought about this at the time, that, people get married after some preparation, maybe 6 months, if that. We had 2 years of preparation.
Yeah.
What is a religious life? What are the vows? What's expected of you? What are the difficulties? And if after 2 years of preparation, we're 20 or 21 when we start, if we're going to be let out of the vows we make, why should someone who gets married and finds out that it's a lot different than they expected, why should they be held to their vows,
Yeah.
No, I think there's a great obligation on the part of vowed religious to be faithful to their vows as a strengthening factor for those who have made their vows in marriage.
I think that's right, yeah. Right, the two enforce each other, don't they?
Absolutely.
Priesthood and married life. Tell me a bit about the exercises. I've had the privilege, 4 or 5 times in my life, doing not a 30-day. I must confess I've chickened out of a 30-day retreat. I've done the 8-day retreat a number of times, and I've always loved it. I find the exercises very rich. Tell me about your relationship with the exercises.
Well, that's one of the geniuses of Ignatius, that there's nothing new in the exercises.
Yeah.
The way you organize, put them together, it's a way of finding out God's will in your life, and he's a master at doing it. Of course, it was inspired by the Spirit, I believe. Now, by the way, I made 30-day retreat 3 times.
3 times.
Only twice you're supposed to, but I made one with the Lubac in just the 2 of us.
He was your director?
In Belgium,
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
In Belgium, but they wouldn't count that for my long retreat. But think about that. I had 30 days with Henri de Lubac giving me my long retreat, It was great.
Give me one insight from that. So you're with one of the great figures of 20th century Catholicism. Give me an insight he conveyed to you during those 30 days.
Well, I can't remember too many details, but I just remember at the end of the retreat, he said, Père Fessio, allez en avant, go forward, So that was my advice and my kind of charter from him, which I've tried to follow.
That's Junipero Serra, too, isn't that? Siempre adelante. That's, that's his great motto. Well, that's interesting. That was the advice that de Lubac gave you. Listen, let's talk about him, because your life story implicates you in the lives of some of the most interesting people in the 20th century in the Catholic Church.
And not just interesting, a lot of, but profound thinkers, really men of the church. I look back, Bishop, and wonder, how did this ever happen?
Yeah.
It was the origin. You mentioned Father Michael Buckley, Cornelius Michael Buckley before.
Right.
I was at the University of Santa Clara as a regent In the Jesuit formation, you got your spiritual formation and vision, then a couple of years of philosophy, and in between, you teach at a high school or at a college, and then you do theology. So I was in Santa Clara University as a regent, a mister they called us, a scholastic and unordained Jesuit in formation. And Father Buckley and I they called us the Fessio Buck Productions. We put on various things. We had a program for young kids in the East Bay, East San Jose, who were disadvantaged kids. And it was the 60s, okay? And I'm trying to grow a beard and trying to play the guitar, and neither one very successfully. But my superior, the rector there, Father Copeland, was a former World War II chaplain, very straight down the line, man of regulation. And I found out by the grapevine he didn't like my growing this beard. So I went up to the provincial. Father Buckley and I drove up there to San Francisco, saw the provincial. I said, look, I'm not a rebel. I want to be, I'll shave the beard. He just laughed and he said, well, have you ever thought about going to Europe for theology?
Okay.
I said, no, I haven't thought about it. You want to think about it? He said, yeah, think about it. So on the way back, because Father Buckley had been at Fourvière, the Jesuit theology, I said, well, I'll go there too. So that's how I got to growing a beard.
Led you to
got me to Lyon, and Fourvière, which is a theology. Then I got to Lubac. And at that time, this is after the council, 5 or 6 years, and he was démodé, he was old-fashioned. And but I was very impressed by him, and here we are in the city of Saint Irenaeus, right next to his cathedral, or his church. And so he became my mentor. And he was injured in World War I.
Seriously, right? He had serious head.
Very serious shrapnel head injury. In fact, he probably has the record of being the longest, the Jesuit in the longest novitiate, because he was a first-year novice before the war started. The war began. He was 5 years mobilized, in World War I, and then he came out and finished his second year. But because of that injury, he couldn't always go to classes when he was studying philosophy and theology. So he stayed in his room and he read the entire Patrologia Latina et Graeca by Mina. Now, for those who don't know, this is a great scholar of the mid-19th century who collected all the writings of the fathers, the Latin fathers, and they were in Latin, and then the Greek fathers in Greek with Latin translation. It's 100 volumes, I think, something like that. 100
library shelf.
So he read the whole thing. Just think about that. I mean, immersing himself, and that really led to him, I think, being such a profound thinker and a great mind of the church.
And when you met him, so it's in the early 70s, he would at that time have been in
76
his
years
70s,
old.
right? Having been through an awful lot of drama in his own life, beginning with World War I, the Jesuits, emerging as a major theological figure, and then enduring a lot of harassment, you might say, from people within the church, even being silenced effectively.
That's right.
In, the 1950s, just before the council.
It was just, actually, he wrote Sur Naturel in 1946, right after the war, and paper was very short. In fact, I saw one of the first printings of this thing where the first half was on shiny paper, the second half on kind of rough paper. So it wasn't well distributed, but there were people in Rome that were upset with what he did, and they had him silenced,
Garrigou-Lagrange played a role, didn't he, in some of that?
I think so, but it was Boyer, B-O-Y-E-R, I think, who was the main player in that. Not Bouyer. Boyer's different.
Right. But, de Lubac is up for canonization, right? He's being considered.
Yes, his cause has been introduced, that's right.
I think if he's canonized, I pray that he is, it would be because of those years, right, where he showed extraordinary patience. He didn't go into open rebellion against the church. He didn't, engage in polemics. He.
No, in fact, I heard from Father Bernard Cespoe, who was a professor there at the same when I was there, that when this happened, de Lubac had not been teaching, but had been writing, and he was told by the general at the behest of the Pope to cease teaching, which he wasn't doing anyway, and cease writing. And in those days, maybe still, after lunch, which is the main meal, they go down into the basement area and they have these little demi-tasses of coffee.
And cigars, usually.
Yeah, cigars, coffee, which is thick as like engine.
Like taking medicine, right?
Okay. But they were all very upset and they were complaining about the Pope, and they were criticizing the Pope for doing this. And de Lubac left in tears saying, I can't have you criticize the Pope in my presence.
Is that right?
He left.
That's pretty good, huh? The story I've heard along those lines is at the council itself. He's on the steps of St. Peter's with Hans Kung. And Hans Kung was just going on about how terrible this had been, what had been done to de Lubac, how unfair it was, and how the church. And de Lubac's response was, Elle est quand même notre mère. But she's still our mother.
Yeah.
You know, and I thought that captured the spirituality beautifully. He wasn't in favor of his being silenced, but he accepted it.
Well, I became his amanuensis because he was not well at times, and so he'd dictate to me, and I'd type his letters for him. But one day I was in his little room, and his study there, and the phone rang, you know, so I get up to leave, and oh, no, it's okay. And he's saying, oh, no, Papa, I can't do it, no. Hangs up. What's that all about? Huh. Well, it was Cardinal Villot. He wants me to come to Rome for the Papal Theological Commission meeting in October, but I really can't. I'm not well, and I can't go alone. There's no one to go with me. I said, I'll go with you.
Oh.
Will you? Picks up the phone. He calls, I'll be coming, you know. So I go to Rome, accompanied Lubac to the meeting, and there was Ronner and Lonergan and Bouillet and Congar and Ratzinger, Balthasar. I mean,
wow. This is the International Theological Commission.
Yeah. This was the A team.
The cream
all
of the
there.
crop.
Here I'm this little, you know, recently ordained priest and everything. But while he was there, he was asked to give a talk at San Luigi Francesi, which is the French National Church in Castelnaudary there. Yeah. And so I go and I bring him to give this talk, and I'm sitting there. It turns out, you know, I didn't know what was happening, but I was sitting in the front row with Balthasar on my left and Wojtyła on my right. Okay. And so
not bad, huh?
And so Lubac is up there, and he'd been sick for the last couple of days, and I had to, you know, walk him up there. And he's at the table, and you see he's very pale, but he's speaking about the role of Peter and of the papacy in the early church. And, you know, as he's speaking about Peter and speaking about the papacy, you could just see him kind of come to life. It was like watching the resurrection, you know. And he finally, it was over standing ovation. He grabs, he says, we have to go outside. And he grabs my arm, we walk outside. He says, J'ai fait mon devoir comme Jésuite. J'ai défendu le pape. I've done my duty as Jesuit. I've defended the Pope.
Yeah.
Because this was under Paul VI, you know, who was criticized quite heavily. Anyway, but that was.
That's still a basic Jesuit task, isn't it? I mean, to stand in solidarity with the Pope.
Yeah. No, he was a great man of the church. I mean, and wonderful scholar, sense of humor.
You know, I attended his funeral mass.
You did?
I was a student in Paris, doctoral student, you know, and de Lubac had died. And so the funeral was at Notre Dame, and so I walked down there, no idea if I'd get in, anything. I thought, I'm just going to go. I went up to the door, and I was stopped, and the guy said, are you a member of the family? And I said, no. And he said, est-ce que vous êtes théologien? Are you a theologian? And I was a theology student, so I said, oui. And they brought me, and I sat in this wonderful seat. I'll never forget it. It was very moving. He came, the body in a very simple wooden coffin with his cardinal's hat on top.
Yeah.
But it was Cardinal Etchegaray spoke afterwards. Okay. And he recalled, when you mentioned Wojtyła, I thought of this, because Wojtyła becomes Pope, and he visits the Institut Catholique to speak to the faculty, and de Lubac is kind of in the background. And Wojtyła notices him, voilà, le père de Lubac. And he bowed his head like this to him. So Etchegaray says at the funeral, so once again, in the name of the Pope, I bow my head before Père de Lubac. So, I mean, not a dry eye in the house. And then they rang the deep bell at Notre Dame, which they rarely rang. So, no, it was a great privilege to be present for that. What was it? I'm just curious, what was a seminar with de Lubac like? So you're around the table with him and some students.
Actually, no, he wasn't teaching, no seminars. It was
just one-on-one?
Just one-on-one.
What was that like? So you're with him in a room and you read a text together or something?
Yeah, and I would, you know, ask him questions about things he had written. And, you know, most of his books, the bottom half is, you know, apparatus, footnotes and stuff.
Right.
Just the only part of the page is text. And I mean, you know, once he'd done a new book and I read it and I thanked him for it. Oh, that's just, there's nothing there but I'm just quoting the fathers. I said, well, yeah, that's like Rembrandt saying that the paint just came out of the tube, you know?
Yeah,
I mean, because the way he weaves it together.
Yeah.
I think his books are are classic. They'll be read
They're
for
wonderful.
centuries if we go on that long, you know.
Well, I read them in Ignatius Press editions, when I was a young guy. But back in those days, so now I'm in the 1980s, I'm in the seminary. We had to read those books kind of under the covers with a flashlight,
Yeah.
right? Because in those days, de Lubac and Ratzinger and Balthasar, I mean, arch conservatives and,
Yeah.
kind of dangerous people, and extraordinary than how that has shifted and changed. Here's de Lubac's silence for being, if you want, like too much of a liberal voice
Right.
in those days. Then in my time, too much of a hyper-conservative voice. And then today, again, he's seen by some as a modernist. I think the church kind of shifting in odd ways around
But
him.
Balthasar, de Lubac,
Yeah.
Ratzinger, Bouillet, they're in the center, deeply
Right.
rooted in tradition, and yet open to newness. I mean, look what
Right.
Balthasar did in his whole theology
Yeah,
of
yeah.
aesthetic. I mean, wonderful. And yet, who could be more rooted in the tradition of the church than
Right.
Balthasar?
Maybe one more question about de Lubac, because I'm curious to get your view on this. John Milbank, some years ago, said Rahner tended to naturalize the supernatural. De Lubac supernaturalized the natural, and that makes all the difference.
I think that's a good
And it's one of
way
those lines that stuck in my mind. It's like, yeah, that's helpful. Because one way I characterize Catholic liberalism is just that tendency to naturalize the supernatural. But what de Lubac was doing in the Surnaturel, another text, was, no, it's a grace, building on nature. As Aquinas says, it's not turning the wine into water, but turning water into wine.
Right.
That's what de Lubac was up to, and I think that's right.
I think that's right. Very much so, yeah.
Okay. So let's go from de Lubac now. We got the Ratzinger and Balthasar connection. And if I get it right, you end up writing your doctoral paper on Balthasar, on his ecclesiology, but under the direction of Joseph Ratzinger. And that was at the suggestion of Henri de Lubac.
What happened was,
Is that right?
after my second year of theology in France, and as I was contemplating doing a doctorate, my superiors asked me to do that. And I asked Father Lubac, I said, well, what we suggest I write on? He said, Hans Joseph Balthasar, the greatest theologian of our time and perhaps all time. And he was a very measured man.
He de Lubac now is.
De Lubac, yeah.
right.
For him to say something like that, well, okay, that's good. Well, where should I do it? Well, there's a fine young theologian in Regensburg, Professor Ratzinger. We're friends. I'll write him on your behalf, because Ratzinger was overwhelmed with people wanting to study under him, But de Lubac wrote on my behalf, and then Ratzinger accepted me as a student. So I went to Regensburg and was taking classes I was in seminars with Ratzinger in his classes, and then he was my doctoral father.
Take me to the first time you meet Ratzinger. What was that like?
I don't remember.
No, but you're in Regensburg and you have an appointment with him. He's young at that time. He would have been only
40s.
What, 40 something,
Yeah,
right?
something like that, yeah.
So you meet, what was your first impression of Ratzinger?
I don't remember my first impression, but I remember my impression.
Your second impression.
I mean, he's a public figure, so everybody knows now what he's really like, who wants to know. And that was just wonderful, warm, gentle, friendly, good sense of humor. I have a friend who was with me there as a doctoral student, Father Vincent Toomey, who was an Irish priest, wonderful Irish priest. And he had been with Rahner the year before in a graduate seminar. And he said, the Hauptseminar, where you got 8 or 10 or 12 of the graduate students, and one makes their presentation, and then they discuss things and so on. He said, well, in Rahner's seminar, a student made a presentation, and for the rest of the 2 hours, Rahner would talk. With Ratzinger, because we were there together, a presentation we made, he'd say nothing except he'd ask people, what do you think? What do you think? Especially a lot of students who weren't naturally German speaking, like myself. My German was terrible. So he'd say, Fessio, was denkst du, was denken Sie? And so he made us all talk. He listened. At the end, he'd kind of lean back and in 2 or 3 long German sentences summarize the whole 2 hours, just putting things in the right proportion, the right emphasis. It was like a symphony, just the grand finale of a symphony he produced there. It was phenomenal. His ability to listen, to grasp what everyone was saying, and to kind of weigh it all and put it together. It was really beautiful, wonderful experience, which, by the way, when John Paul II asked him to oversee the catechism, that's perfect, He's the perfect man to be able to bring not only all the teachings of the Catholic Church together in one place, but to organize it in a way that gives everything its hierarchical value. It's beautifully done.
And it's interesting, you talk to bishops of a certain age who would have known Ratzinger when they went for their ad limina visits. That's exactly what they said. That, bishops around a table, they'd each share something
Yeah.
about their diocese. He would listen very patiently, and then at the end, perform that little symphonic move, right?
Yeah.
Of getting it all. So he never lost that touch.
No.
And the skill, with summary, the precision of language, all of that. I've seen films of the young Ratzinger speaking, and they are extraordinary. Whether it's in German or his beautiful French. He had great French, very good English. An extraordinary performer in that sense. I mean, he was just the master of that situation. But how often would you have the seminar? Once a week? Was it once every couple weeks?
Oh, the seminar. Boy, I don't even recall how often we had them. Whatever the schedule was. But we had classes with them, and then the seminar, and then of course private conversations with them. And then also in 1977, he was made Archbishop of Munich Freising.
Yeah.
And he had about 50 doctoral students that had been there, in the last 10, 15 years. And so we decided, well, let's try and have a continuation of this in some sense.
Right.
And so we formed the Schülerkreis,
Right, yeah.
a group of his former
So
students.
you were part of that from the beginning of it. You were part of that Schülerkreis.
Yes, I was, because
Yeah.
I finished my degree in 74 or 75, finished the course in 74 and the writing in 75. And 77 was he stopped teaching because he became Archbishop. Unlike you, who continues teaching while you're a bishop. But I remember at the time there was another one of my classmates was Father Schönborn, Father von Schönborn at the time, now Cardinal Schönborn. So we were both there with Ratzinger. Schönborn did not do his degree under Ratzinger, but he was there for a year. And we were at one of these Schülerkreis weekends. Every year we'd have a weekend at a monastery. We'd have Mass together. We'd have meals together. We'd have a seminar where someone invited him to give a little talk. And he'd give the homily at the Mass. And it was the 21st Sunday of ordinary time where the gospel is about the 11th hour workers that get paid the same,
Yeah.
And he gave a homily which I've never forgotten. And every time I see that gospel now, I think of that homily. And 20 years later, after Schönborn had become cardinal, he and I were both down at our friend's place in Southern California, Judge Bill Clark, at his chapel. And I read the gospel, and it was that gospel. I thought, I thought about that homily again. I sat down, and Cardinal Schönborn began to give his homily. And he said, 20 years ago, Joseph Ratzinger gave a homily on this text, and here's what he said. And he said the very same thing.
Yeah.
And
It
what was
impressed
that?
Both of you.
I can't say it as eloquently as he did, but basically, he's saying, the people that worked all day in the vineyard were upset because of the people coming the last moment and getting the same reward. And they resented that. But they shouldn't have resented that, because those of us who had the joy and the blessing of being in the vineyard all day with the Lord from the beginning, suffering with him, rejoicing with him, eating with him, working with him by his side, we have nothing to complain about. We've been there the whole day.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a beautiful homily.
Yeah. We had the privilege of being with the Lord all that time.
Yeah.
So why complain about it?
Yeah.
I know that chapel in California, Judge Clark's chapel.
Oh, yeah.
I was invited to say Mass there when I was out in California.
Oh, were you?
It's
Okay.
up on a hill, as I remember.
Yeah,
You're
but
coming
hills.
along and way up on this hill
on
with
the
a
brow of the
commanding
hill, yeah.
view. And Clark, who had a big impact on Reagan, didn't he?
Oh, you did? He
In
made
great-
Reagan pro-life.
Right, and shaping his imagination in a more religious way. I got twice to the Reagan Ranch when I was out there, because it was in my region. And I was struck by the Catholic symbols in the Reagan Ranch, and the impact that man had on this very important political figure of the last 50 years. I'm glad you mentioned that. Ratzinger, man of the council. He's a young Peritus under Cardinal Frings, right, at Vatican II. Would have been seen as one of the kind of young Turks, the more liberal-minded people, along with Kungs, Gillibex, Rahner, and company. What would you say was his dominant idea in regard to the council? Because I think of him and Wojtyła as great men of the council. They knew it, they were there, and they wanted to give it the proper interpretation. What was central, do you think, to Ratzinger's sense of the council?
Well, First of all, in my own coming to know him, having been mentored by the Lubac and the reading of the massive work of Balthasar, I thought that Ratzinger was kind of a young popularizer,
Right.
Not necessarily an original thinker, but
Yeah.
my opinion changed very quickly because definitely he's a theologian in his own right.
Oh, yeah.
But I think the answer to your question is in December 22nd, 2005, when he first met with the cardinals after became Pope, that he said there's two interpretations of the council.
Right. Yeah.
There is it's a rupture from tradition. Everything pre-Vatican II is to be disregarded, or it is a renewal in harmony with tradition.
Yeah.
And that was his idea that, yes, there must be renewal and reform, but it had to be in continuity and not in a rupture with tradition. That was his whole view,
I was certainly trained that way, as a young guy coming of age after the council, the Vatican II as revolution.
Yeah, exactly.
And it was, kind of darkness before, great burst of light in 1965, and now we're in the post-revolutionary period. That's, I think, how my generation was shaped.
Yeah.
And that's why people like, I think, Ratzinger, de Lubac, Balthasar were kind of seen as suspicious figures. They were counter-revolutionary figures, when I was in the seminary. But finally, they helped us to see what you just said, the huge continuity between Vatican II and the rest of the great tradition. A development, we're all, I think, great admirers of John Henry Newman, a development of doctrine, to be sure. Development in important ways, too. And I mean, I wouldn't want to stand with those who say, oh, nothing really important happened at Vatican II. No, I think there really were important developments in ecclesiology, the understanding of the laity, understanding of the priesthood, et cetera.
Yes, all those things.
But not a rupture. May I suggest it's still a lively issue in the life of the church, having just come from the Synod. I think that's still an issue that people talk about. How do you read Vatican II? And those of us who are saying, read it as a development and continuity with the great tradition. So it's still a lively question.
It is. Now, how did you break out of the straitjacket that you were formed in? Because you were in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
And that was the whole thing about Vatican II. Has been,
Right.
We're come of age now. Everything pre-Vatican II is worthless. What happened? Did you resist that at the time, or were you sucked in by that?
I had a certain grace in my life, which was when I was 14 years old. A young Dominican friar taught me one of Thomas's arguments for God's existence, and it set me on this path of discovery. I was a baseball player when I was 14. I wanted to be a Chicago Cubs shortstop. So I wasn't interested in the life of the mind or anything like that. And then that set me on this path, and it got me deeply interested in Aquinas. So that was a kind of ballast that I had. But then I also went to Catholic University on this Basilian scholarship, which was a master's program in philosophy. And I had people like John Whipple. I don't know if you know John Whipple, who just died a few months ago. One of the great Thomists in the world taught me. And then Robert Sokolowski, who became kind of an intellectual hero of mine, taught at Catholic U. And that gave me an added sense of the richness of the tradition. So as I was being kind of instructed in standard Catholic liberalism of the time, I had happily this counterweight.
Well, when I was 14, I was a baseball player too, and as well. And also, I was at a Jesuit high school. I asked myself, wait a minute, why am I Catholic? Because my parents are Catholic, but other parents are Jewish or Muslim or whatever. That's not a good reason. I began to think, well, does God exist or not?
It's interesting.
That's a very important period in a person's life, seems to me, that high school period.
Yes. And I've said that for years in my pastoral work. Don't neglect that time. And the teachers, I think of the teachers I had in high school were some of the most influential of my entire life.
Same with me.
The kindergarten through graduate school, but the high school teachers were the ones.
I've said the same thing, that just like you, I've been to college, post-college, graduate work, but the most important educational time of my life was in high school.
Yeah.
And the teachers I had, I still remember them.
Yeah. Well, we could have both been great baseball players.
I hit 435 my last season. How about you?
What were you batting?
I hit 435 my last season.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
When I was in Little League, I was a very good hitter, and then my eyes started going bad. And I could tell one season my batting average plummeted. And then we went to the eye doctor.
Field. I was a klutz in the field,
I was a shortstop, and I was a good hitter. But then, as I say, my eyesight started going.
Yeah, well, it put me in right field as far away as you get from any action,
Yeah. No, I still love baseball. But, speaking of baseball, John Whipple, Monsignor Whipple, the story always went that he faced a decision, either to go into the Cincinnati Reds farm system or to become a Basilian, to study philosophy, because he was that good a pitcher. and he decided to become a Basilan. So he might have become a pro baseball player.
Well, I had a choice to join the Pittsburgh farm system or continue studying engineering. And I said, I'm never going to be a great baseball player, but I'd like to be an engineer.
But they were pursuing you for the Pittsburgh Pirates farm system?
Yeah.
No kidding. Well, you must have been pretty good.
I wasn't, but I.
No, your fielding must have been better than you were suggesting.
No, I was a pretty good hitter, you know.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
That was
In fact,
pretty good.
the two of us were performing for the scout. One was Jim Fregosi,
Yeah.
who went on to be a
Yeah.
major league player, and he coached the Angels, I think,
Of course, the Pirates of the 1970s, when I was a kid, Roberto Clemente
Yes.
was one of my heroes, one of the great players. Reaches 3,000 hits exactly, and then dies in the plane accident.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we talk about baseball
Okay.
at our next
All right,
gathering.
next
You know
session.
what? I'm curious. So we got Lubac, Ratzinger. Now, Balthasar. So you write on Balthasar's ecclesiology, not
Right.
under his direction, but on his topic. But you would have come to know him in those years.
Oh, very well. Yes, in fact, he helped found this secular institute, the Johannes Gemeinschaft,
Johannes Gemeinschaft. Yeah.
the community of St. John, and they have a little kind of a chalet on the Rigi, which is a mountain between Zurich and Lucerne. And Balthasar would go there in the summer for a few weeks, and he'd invite to Lubac, and so the Lubac would bring us up with him. So I was there for a couple of weeks with Balthasar and the Lubac, being able to have meals with them. I still have my chalice that they've celebrated Mass with,
What language were you speaking at that time?
French. Yeah, because
okay.
Lubac didn't speak German.
And Balthasar had beautiful French.
Oh,
I've
my
heard him
gosh.
speaking French on YouTube, but he has beautiful French.
Excellent French, extremely good. And his English is quite good, too. But I remember, for one thing, was the Lubac had just come back from Crete. And so he was recounting to Balthasar his trip to Crete. And I'm listening to this, thinking to myself, if I went to Crete myself, I could not experience this as well as I can listening to him talk about it. Because, what a historian does is not just recount everything that's happened, but pick out the important things and put them in a pattern,
Yeah.
And de Lubac had that ability. It was just beautiful. And then listening to those two people talk, it was like watching two galaxies coming into intersection, whatever. It's so glorious,
Balthasar is staggering. And when I was a kid, when I was going through theology, Ronner was the mastermind.
Oh, yeah.
So we tended to read something from the Bible, something from the Fathers, a little Aquinas, and then Ronner.
Yeah.
And Ronner would settle the matter.
Yeah.
That's the way it usually went.
Yeah.
And I have great admiration for Ronner. Heck, I read, the Foundations of Christian Faith, and we read Theological Investigations. And, he was a mastermind figure.
He was.
But it was my discovery, Balthasar. I would have known the name Balthasar maybe when I was going through seminary. But, we didn't read him at all. It was Father Guy Mancini of St. Meinrad. Father Guy,
Heard the name.
monk down there. And I was there on a retreat, young guy, and I'm in his room. And I see Ronner on the shelf. I said, "Oh, Ronner." And he goes, "Yeah, I cut my teeth on Ronner, but the one you should read is Balthasar." Oh, Balthasar. I don't really know him that well. Then I get to Paris for my doctoral studies. And I go into the Procure, the great theological bookstore in Paris.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing all the Casper and Ronner and all Kung, the usual names, Skilobex at the time. And then the Procure had 2 shelves of Balthasar. And it just struck me. I thought, wow, that's the guy that Guy Mancini talked about. And maybe I should read him. So I got the Mysterium Pascale in French. And I was trying to get my French better, so I bought a French edition of it. And I brought it down to the Seine, right behind Notre Dame. I used to love to sit there to read. And I read that book, and it's just like a world opened up. And then I started going through the Glory of the Lord and all that. But I would have read those finally when I got home. Then I started reading them even more carefully in all of your editions. It would have been all the Ignatius.
Well, that's how
Right.
There's a parallel story here that I didn't drink before I entered the Jesuits in the Jesuits until I got to France, age 27. And there you have wine with your meal and you add water to it. It's ordinary wine and everything, And I realized that wine's not alcohol. It's not a drink. It's it's food. It's part of a meal.
Yeah.
I went to Bavaria to study, with Ratzinger. I discovered 13 kinds of beer. Okay, not brands, but Märzen beer, Weissen beer, Bock, double Bock, and so on. I came back to the United States, had my first sip of an American beer. I spat it out.
It was so insipid.
And I said, if you're going to call this beer, I needed another name for what I was drinking in Bavaria.
Yeah.
Well, after I got back, after my doctoral studies, I was giving retreats to women religious, and at a question and answer session, one said, well, Father, you keep quoting Lubac and Ratzinger. Who are the great American theologians? And I told them the story about the beer, and I said, if you're going to call these theologians over here, I need another name for what I have over there. Because this is different level, different category.
There was a theological culture those men all came out of.
Exactly.
That is gone, though. Even in Europe, it's gone, isn't it? I mean, grounded in the great tradition and in Latin and Greek and the fathers and Aquinas. I mean, look, Rahner knew Aquinas, remarkably well. Puts him in dialogue with Heidegger and Kant and everybody else. But he came out of that same culture. Ratzinger can give a flawless lecture in Latin. That's long gone.
I was at the Synod in '87. He was making jokes in Latin. he was giving a presentation, but his little ironic things would stick in there.
Latin.
Oh, yeah, in Latin.
But Balthasar, in a way, reminds me of someone like a James Joyce. That he has this mind that covers the whole world. And it's like swimming in an ocean. You can get lost easily in Balthasar. He's not as tidy as, let's say, a Rahner, or a Ratzinger. There's something oceanic, I always think about Balthasar.
That's right.
Which makes him challenging. But at the same time, it just opens up this world to you. The stress on beauty, obviously, which I've used now in my work of evangelization. It's been a huge principle. I learned that from Balthasar. We often go from the true to the good to the beautiful, but he wants to reverse that. Begin with the beautiful.
Right.
And I just think evangelically, it's a better approach because people are very reactive today to claims of truth and goodness. But if you just show them, look at this beautiful thing, this beautiful cathedral, this beautiful text, this beautiful whatever, it draws them in. And then I think of like D.C. Schindler. I am convinced by what he says that it's the most important of the transcendentals because it's what first gets our attention.
Yes.
It's first splendor. And then once it's got your attention, you start thinking,
draws you in.
Here's what's true about it, here's what's good about it. But that's a master theme, obviously. But as you look at Balthasar and you say, okay, you did ecclesiology. What's the master theme? What would you say the thing you really learned from Balthasar?
Well, like you say, it's an ocean, right? So this is. But I would say, going back to you talking about Rahner, because Rahner was a great mind, no question about it. But it was kind of a mechanical mind almost. Right. And Balthasar had that breadth of culture, music, history, art, literature, all those sorts of things. And I would say it's that total kind of culture that he has, Catholic culture that embraces everything, that drew me in and impresses me still. And, where are the big Rahnerians today? I mean, Rahner is pretty much history now, isn't he?
Right.
But Balthasar is growing.
Growing
in his influence because it's so rich. It's so rich and so deep. And
he operated outside the academic establishment, didn't he? He wasn't a professor at a university. He never was.
He wasn't.
And that gave him a certain liberty in his thinking.
But I think he talks about kreisendes Denken, circling thought, the idea of, he gives the example of the sculpture of David, Michelangelo there in Florence, where you have to walk around that thing to see. You can't, 1 per second is enough. And also, theology on its knees. I mean, when you read Balthasar, you are aware of someone who prays. It's really embedded in his prayer.
What was it like to be with him? Photos of Balthasar, he was tall, wasn't he?
Tall.
Was he kind of a physically imposing, impressive guy?
Well, he was tall, somewhat slender. And he had kind of a shyness to him.
Yeah.
A very kind of aristocratic. But shy. But always he was warm and friendly. And I remember, up at this little chalet, he says, well, have you ever read The Bridge of San Luis Rey? Thornton Wilder.
Thornton Wilder, yeah.
No, I said, no. Of course, he read everything. He read all of Agatha Christie.
In all the different languages.
Oh, you should read him, He calls back to Basel and has the book set up for me, so I can read Thornton Wilder. That's just how very, very kind. Oh, another thing. I went, this is after Ignatius Press started. I was traveling through Basel. I stopped to see him and spend the night. And someone gave me this book by Manfred Hauke called Women Priests, ? About 500 pages. And so we had dinner in the evening, and I said, well, what do you think about this book? Well, let me take a look at it. So I gave it to him. And then we went to bed, and this is about a 4-story building that he has, his apartment type thing, but he has the whole thing. And every wall of every room was lined with bookcases, you know. And I'm an ex-engineer, I'm kind of a quantitative guy, so I wandered through the building, and I estimated, you know, how many books per foot, how many feet, and I estimated 30,000 volumes.
Yeah.
And I picked them out, and, you know, Germans, like, they'll have 26 volumes of Nietzsche and, you know, 42 volumes of Kant and that sort of stuff, and I'd pick them out at random, and every one, he had notes in the margin.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next morning, we get up, have breakfast, and he has you about the book. He says, well, the Theological Commission, the Papal Theological Commission, was supposed to discuss women's priesthood, but now we don't have to. This book has it all, you know.
Yeah.
But it was a 500-page book. What was he doing all night? I don't know. But in the morning, he gave it to me. He says, this is the book you want to. So we did. We published that thing in English.
He'll write, for him, a minor book that would be for anyone else the masterwork of their entire career.
Yeah.
And Balthasar tosses it off as, you know, he's a 400-page study of Maximus the Confessor or The Little Flower or something.
Yeah.
Anybody else, that would be their Hauptwerk, right? That'd be their masterpiece.
Well, I don't know what your high school was like, but we took the Iliad in high school, okay?
Yeah.
When Balthasar was in high school, he translated the Iliad from Greek into German.
Yeah. No, he was a mastermind. There's no question.
Yeah.
I mean, what's Lubac's famous line, the most cultivated man in Europe, right?
Yeah.
Which is pretty high praise coming from someone like de Lubac.
Right, and Ratzinger praising them both in the same way in his book Milestones.
Right, yeah.
Page 141 or 143, he says, yeah, two of the greatest minds of the church.
Do you know, I wonder if he could confirm this. I've heard the story over the years that at a certain point in the 70s, de Lubac, Balthasar, maybe Ratzinger and others got together to think about, now, who should the next pope be? And that they identified Wojtyła, that he would be a good candidate. Have you ever heard that story?
I don't know about that story. I know they did get together to start Communio magazine.
Well, of course, Communio, yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
And I do know I was, after he became cardinal, I was stopping through Paris, and I came on the night flight, so I wanted to celebrate Mass. I went up to visit the Lubac and Rue de Sèvres, and he had a little suite there with his little sleeping quarters and his study, and then a little chapel. And I said, could I say Mass in your chapel? Of course, you know. Cardinal Lubac in his 80s served my Mass on his knees.
He was cardinal
Anyway,
at the time.
Mass is over.
Yeah.
He goes into the restroom, and I'm standing there, and I see this dossier there. It says, correspondance papale, you know, like papal correspondence. Oh, what's in there? You know, I open that thing up, and
Are you over?
and there's letters from him and Wojtyła, you know, before Wojtyła was pope. Oh, and I got a card from him too. When Wojtyła was elected, I got a card from Lubac saying, "Thank God we have a Humani Vitae pope." That's what he said.
Is that what he said?
Humani
That's
Vitae
interesting.
pope, yeah.
I wonder, what was it like for you, 1978? So I'm 18 years old, the year of the three popes. So to me, it was like, oh yeah, the popes died and a new pope, and you know, I was interested, but in a sort of external way. But you, who knew all these people, what was your reaction when Karl Wojtyła came out on that balcony?
Well, that was 78.
78.
I was teaching.
Yeah. You would have met him at that point, and you knew all his friends. And,
I had met him, but didn't know him that well. I mean, I hadn't really talked to him or anything. You know, I was happy. I didn't know much about him though.
yeah, okay.
But when Benedict, when
of course,
Ratzinger became
Benedict,
pope, that was I remember that very well.
Yeah.
I mean, I was because I was confident he'd be chosen because there was no one else.
Yeah.
There was no one else of that stature. You know.
Well, the cardinals especially knew that. So in the outside world, the Panzer Cardinal and all that nonsense, but the cardinals who had been dealing with him for years knew all of his great gifts and strengths and his balance and his moderation.
That was the advantage of him being a curial cardinal for so long that all the other cardinals had got to know him, who he really was. You know.
Right. Oh, no, I remember 2005, yeah, and the death of John Paul and how dramatic that was, and his
Yeah.
funeral, and extraordinary. I had the privilege twice. I was a scholar in residence at the North American College in Rome. I was working on a book both times. But I would, in 2007 especially, Benedict was doing talks on the Church Fathers.
Yes.
And I always made a point, whatever I was doing, I would get down to St. Peter's Square to hear him. And what invariably struck me was, this is a church father talking about the church fathers. His bearing and his command of language and his style and his theological depth and the ranginess of his mind and the sort of calmness of his soul. I mean, all of that was on display. And it was very moving to me.
He was born on April 16th, 1927, which was Holy Saturday, okay?
Yeah.
And in those days, you could have the vigil mass in the morning. So he's born at 4:30 in the morning, and at 8:30 his mom takes him to the vigil mass, and he's baptized at the vigil mass. So his natural life and his supernatural life began in the heart of the church's liturgy.
Pretty good.
And that's always meant a lot to him, So I had a premonition that he was going to die on some symbolic day, which he did. December
He died the
30th.
31st, right?
So the vigil of the Mary, Mother of God.
Yeah.
And then 2 days later, it's Basil and Gregory, okay? Gregory of Nazianzen. Basil's brother is also Gregory of Nyssa. And those three men, saints, fathers of the church, doctors of the church, in the 4th century, which is the Arian century of the disasters, in the church. And I thought to myself, I'm willing to bet that before too long, a century or so, we'll have 3 more doctors of the church. There will be de Lubac, born in 1896, to Balthasar, 1905, Ratzinger, 1927. The 3 of them were close friends.
Yeah.
They corresponded. They mentored each other in a certain sense. I think those are 3 great men that are going to stand out for the rest of church history, just like Basil, Gregory, and Gregory.
Yeah,
honestly.
I agree with that. And I'm thinking of, the one that's currently up for that, Newman. We bishops just, decided to ratify what the English bishops had said. Let's make him a doctor of the church, and we all voted.
Yeah.
I think there was 1 vote against it. I don't know who it was.
Really?
All the bishops voted, except for 1. But and Newman was an influence on all 3 of them, wasn't he?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Of course, yeah.
It's been said he was the most important non-present figure at Vatican II, that Newman was kind of haunting the minds of so many of the great players at Vatican II.
I think Mueller and Shaban in a sense too, but that was more in the background. Yeah.
Shaban is somebody that I've only in recent years really discovered. And talk about another sort of mastermind figure
Yes.
who died young. Shaban was only in his 40s when he died, right?
Yeah.
But that's an impressive mind. And Ratzinger loved him.
That's right.
Ratzinger was very indebted to Shaban. I could talk to you theology all day. Let's talk a little bit about Ignatius Press. So you come back from this heady experience in Europe with these great figures. You've taken in their thought, but also their personalities. You realize how important they are for the life of the church, and you say, look, we got to publish these people in English to make them available to an American audience or an English-speaking audience. And you pulled it off. I mean, it's been a massive success, hasn't it? And indeed has fulfilled that mission, then gone beyond it, but certainly fulfilled that mission of bringing these people. As I say, I would have read all these folks in your editions, So mission accomplished that way. Tell me about the beginning of it, though. Opposition to it, difficulties, obstacles as you were getting that going?
Well, it started, I met this wonderful Catholic layman when I came to San Francisco, '74, John Galton. We're still good friends. We used to get retreats together and so on. We had a reading group. And in this reading group, we take different texts and stuff. But from time to time, I would bring in a book by Ratzinger, Lubac, and I'd translate a few paragraphs for them. And John said, Father, he said, this is too important. This should be available in English for everybody. So that's when we started. Well, the first thing we did, we wanted to translate Balthasar and Andrea von Speyer, his directee, the mystical woman there. Yeah. And Balthasar told me to get in touch with Erasmo Leyva Merikakis.
Oh, sure. Marvelous.
Yeah.
Biblical commentator.
And at that time, he just finished his doctorate at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia.
That's
and so he translated von Speyer's book, They Followed His Call. And we submitted that to St. Paul Press in Staten Island, and they published it. But every year in San Francisco, at the institute that I started there called the St. Anne's Institute, we'd have Frank Sheed come and give a talk. Because Frank
great
Sheed
Frank
lived in New
Sheed.
Jersey, but he was from Australia, so
Yeah.
he'd go back and forth every year through San Francisco.
Yeah.
So we'd have Frank Sheed talk to our students. And so one of those times, after we'd given this translation to St. Paul Press, I was walking with Frank Sheed. I said, well, Mr. Sheed, do you think that we should continue, translating and having others publish this, or should we start our own publishing house? Oh, by all means, start your own, but be ready for 10 years of grief.
Oh.
So this woman
You
who
would know, huh?
yeah. So this woman who I'd been giving spiritual direction to, Carolyn Lemon, and I decided we got a grant from the Durancy Foundation in Milwaukee. We went to the library. None of us knew how to make books, but I mean, we picked out the books we liked the paper. We picked out books we liked the typeface. Picked out books we liked the size, and we decided we're going to use
The best of all
National
those.
paper. We're gonna have books of this size, and we're gonna use Bembo font. And so that's how we started Ignatius Press, kind of as amateurs. Well, we're still amateurs in a sense, but and it grew from there. However, if we'd had to survive on selling Balthasar and the Lubac and
Yeah,
so on,
right. It wouldn't have survived.
but Tony Ryan from St. Paul, Minnesota here, came on 2 years later, 1980, as our marketing director. He had a young family, and he wanted to have more family material. So he actually went out and bought these videotapes, and we resell them. And Ignatius Press became the largest distributor of Catholic videos, I think, in the world, if not just the country, because of Tony. Of course, that brought in the income.
Sure, yeah.
And then after that, we had more authors on different topics. And so now we still sit around a table every month and decide what we want to do. And two criteria.
Yeah.
One, do we like it? And two, will it help the church?
Yeah.
So novels, like Michael O'Brien's novels, have become very popular.
Father Elijah, I read, many
Yeah.
years ago.
Yeah. So we're blessed. We're very blessed.
You know, I'm thinking of something. William F. Buckley, when he was getting National Review going and trying to recruit writers for it,
Yeah.
and a guy would say to him, "Oh, no, Bill, I've decided I'm going to stay in academe," or "No, I'm going to go back to the university." Buckley always said, "Out of the arena." Like he had very little respect for people that just wanted to do full-time academic work. He liked people that combined the academic and the institutional, if you want. They were still kind of in the game.
Yeah.
And I think of that a lot, with my own work with Word on Fire and, which is trying to imitate in a way what you did. But the combination of that, of doing the...
Competing with us, that's okay.
It's-
Friendly competition. There's plenty out there to publish.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. But
No, it is great. I want to interrupt you there. It's great what Word on Fire has done. You're publishing it like Ignatius Press, and maybe even more. You believe in beauty.
Yeah.
I mean, the things you publish, they're beautifully done. The art is lovely. It's quality.
Yeah, thank you. On purpose very much. And that's Balthasar. It's
Yeah.
Balthasar's influence.
Exactly.
But the combination of the intellectual and the practical, if you want, the intellectual and the institutional, that you have to have some vehicle to make this real, or it can remain just too abstract.
That's right.
Just kind of caught in the groves of academia.
Yeah.
But I think that's fascinating and is a much needed thing in the life of the church.
When did Word on Fire start publishing things?
Not that long ago. We started publishing only, 4 years ago maybe.
And then when did you start? When did Word on Fire begin?
We kind of trace it back to about the year 2000 when I got on the radio in Chicago.
Okay.
And that was just, I had the idea that we should be doing more to propagate the faith and using at that time, the old media. The new media weren't around yet.
Yeah.
And I just went to a WGN, which is a big radio station in
Yeah.
Chicago. And I said, what would it cost to get on the air, like a sermon show? And they said, at 5:15 a.m. on Sunday morning, we got 15 minutes. It'll cost you $50,000. So I asked the people in my parish for that money.
Yeah.
That's how we started. But I think the fact that people have responded to it is a sign of, this spiritual hunger. We all know about that. It's in people's hearts.
And what's really encouraging to me, Bishop, is that, you reaching out to a wide audience for sure, but I can tell by what you say and what you write that you've been nourished by these same authors that have
Yeah.
nourished me.
Right.
There's a depth there. This isn't just kind of, rhetoric or
Yeah.
superficial stuff. This is deep. It's like I think Ratzinger does this too, with more than de Lubac and von Balthasar, is that he's able to take these tremendously beautiful, powerful Catholic traditional thoughts and put them into a form where, people can understand them and appreciate them,
Yeah, I appreciate that. We've always said truth and beauty are the two things
Yeah.
we want. I grew up on dumbed down Catholicism, and I hated it. It's been a disaster pastorally, and we can document that because the people disaffiliating will say over and over again, I never got my questions answered. I started asking more serious questions, and no answers were forthcoming. So that decision we made as a church a long time ago to dumb it down was a disaster of the first order. So truth, but then beauty is the other element, and I learned that from all these great people. Hey, can I ask you one more thing? I know I could talk to you all day. We're running out of time, but the Jesuits. I will tell you a story from a couple years ago. I was invited by the Jesuits in Chicago, the provincial there, or the leader of the group there, and it was the guys who've been through tertianship, right? So they're ordained, and they've been out now doing some other specialized work. Good guys, and we spent, I'd say, 2 hours. I just came and I did a little talk on the work I'm doing, and then we opened it up for conversation. And it was marvelous. These are people that are working at America Magazine, and they're working at universities and at high schools and all over the place. So after a long conversation, one of the guys said, now, we feel pretty comfortable talking to you, and we've had a nice conversation. Bishop, if you were to give us, some advice, what would it be? And so what I said to them was, I think you guys, the Jesuits, went a little too enthusiastically down social justice road. And I said, I get it. I totally support that, aspect of the church's life. But I said, I think you didn't abandon them, but you turned away a bit from your high schools, your colleges, and the basic instruction in the faith. I said, look, we're dealing now with this disaffiliating generation. And so I said to them, there were about 30 people. I said, I would get back into your high schools and your colleges and your universities, and with an apologetic thrust, to defend the faith and to talk about the faith and to give reasons for the hope that's in us, And so that stayed in my mind. They seemed very, open and receptive to that, and their I think it was the provincial was grateful to me for saying it. But I just want to get your reaction to that about looking at the Jesuits.
Well, we'll see. I mean, who's the major figurehead or the face of the Jesuits today? James Martin.
Well, Jim, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the direction society's gone. But to bring this kind of full circle, this nice round table, we make a circle out of this, social justice. I mean, the Lubac's first book, Bain book, Catholicism, on the social aspects of doctrine, I mean, with that appendix from the fathers of the church, I mean, there's the social doctrine of the church rooted in the dogmatic, core of the church. Beautifully done.
No, that's helpful. That's a good point, because you're right. That text, which was hugely influential on a lot of people, and when I read it, it was one of those texts that just, it opens your eyes in a fresh way. But you're right. It's all about the social implication of every doctrine of the church.
And to bring up another book, Drama of Atheist Humanism, which Joseph Pierce and Vivian Dunard have been discussing on our Forum Book Club. That's a marvelous book. That's never going to get old. And he's talking about the 19th century, which laid the foundations for what happened in the 20th, and we're going through now, the secularization, this idea that we can have a humanism without God.
Yeah.
Well, what happens with that? You destroy man. And he shows it. He just lays it out. So I think if the Jesuits would be more influenced by someone like de Lubac, they would have, I think, a better influence on our culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And that's, again, his ongoing impact and all three of these gentlemen that you were so privileged to know. Yeah. Listen, thank you for taking the time today.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
With us. I enjoyed every minute of the conversation.
Likewise.
God bless you, Father.
God bless you.
you.